it's been very difficult to decide what to read tonight, what to include and what to leave out, because the subject of emigration is such an enormous one that I think I have had to leave out some quite important things. So the book has 50 poems in it, and they're all about aspects of the journey of emigration. And the first thing I want to say, which is pretty obvious, is that London is an immigrant city. If you walk in the street here, statistically, well over half the people who are walking with you will have their family and cultural origins outside of England. My parents were economic migrants from the west of Ireland, and they came here during the war. There was plenty of work, of course, then. And they settled in Cricklewood in northwest London. They were able to buy a house there in 1952, and I grew up there together with my three sisters. So, could somebody close the door? We had some West Indian neighbours, and we even had a few English neighbours. But mostly I grew up with Irish people and London Irish people like me. So London Irish means being born here in London, having an Irish cultural heritage and Irish family. It's different to being Irish because in my lifetime Ireland has changed from being an agricultural country to becoming the modern state it is now, and I have not lived through any of that. The Ireland that I remember doesn't exist anymore. But culturally, I look to Ireland. As a child, that uncertainty about identity was quite difficult and painful. Because I wanted to be Irish, but was I really? I wasn't English, but I wasn't really Irish either. So that brings me to my first poem, Union Jacks. One day when I was a kid at St Agnes, we were all taken up to line the Hendon Way, each of us with a little Union Jack to wave when the Queen Mother's car passed at its own convenience. Our mostly English teachers didn't think it a bit strange to be giving mostly Irish kids Union Jacks to wave at the British royalty. I took my Union Jack home and soaked it in water so that its colours would run and fade. Let it know what it was like to lose definition, to know acute uncertainty. Feelings as fresh now as they were when I held my flag still and did not wave. The dream of all immigrants, I think, is to have a better life for their children. But especially if those immigrants come from conservative tradition, they decide what the better life, what the shape of the better life is going to be, how you should behave, what you should say, what you should believe in. My parents had demands on them, not only from the traditional culture that they brought with them, but from the Catholic Church. The sort of opportunities that I had available to me simply were not on offer to their generation. They just had to work hard. That's what they did. When I was 12, for various reasons, I decided I wanted to be a priest. And what I hadn't foreseen about that decision was that it got me placed in a Catholic public school, a boarding school, which was a big shock culturally and emotionally. It was, I think, probably the first of something that happened in my life where there was a very abrupt transition between one thing and another, and they didn't really relate to one another. I mean, what I found in that boarding school, I'd never come across, and it had no relation to what had gone before. And that has happened a number of times in my life, and I think it's no coincidence that that is exactly the journey that my parents made when they left the rural west of Ireland in the 1940s and came to the big city. So, I'm going to read the second poem. Dislocations. A sea separates one place from another. It is a sea that can be rough and angry, but even when calm, you lose sight of the one shore before the other will appear on the horizon. So you cannot have it both ways. My father certainly never accepted that and expected that I would not either. I set out to create a series of harbours separated by the sea, a sea that would sunder one from another, so that you could not retrace your journey, stretch a cable, build a bridge, or otherwise connect one with the other. I was going to live with the truth that life is a whole series of dislocations. But, as it turned out, I could not live with that, and like my father in his own way, I embarked on doomed voyages that were intended to mend the breach, and to find a living connection between one and another. And finally, I understand that the connection is grief and mourning. Unfortunately, no friends of mine are not welcome at my door. So while we're on the impact of trauma, I'm assuming that most people know that there was a catastrophic famine in Ireland in the 1840s. Over 1 million people died. And 1 million people who survived it emigrated. And many of them died because they were weak and diseased on the famine ships. The people who actually suffered the famine were from an oral culture. So in the districts where my parents came from, which were particularly badly hit, they were probably native Irish speakers. Well, in fact, I know that my great-grandparents were native Irish speakers. They were probably illiterate, and they certainly didn't write things down. So their records were held in songs and stories. What records there are of the famine were written by well-meaning outsiders. And there are no songs, and there are no stories. All there is a profound silence and absence. I've thought more and more about that as I've grown old. And I know that there is a bottomless grief in me, which has no explanation. When my Uncle Mike was hungry, he used to say that he had the Fergorta. Now, I had no idea up until very recently what the Fergorta was, but the Fergorta is a phantom that appears when there's famine, an emaciated, starving man. That was the only reference that I'd ever heard in my family to the famine. And even then, I had no idea that it was a reference to the famine, and I'm not sure that my Uncle Mike did either. I just thought it was a fun phrase. So I'm going to read the next poem now. Fergorta. Those who suffered the famine could not be known by those who wrote things down. Generations of practice have taught the sufferers subservience, avoidance, and secrecy. They are in a place of absolute silence. But see, when he walks across a room, those who knew his father know the father again in the way the sun seems to slide sideways across the room, as if waiting, judging. The father is known in the son's body, a knowledge inaccessible as bone marrow, but just as vital, warm and living. And when he prepares food, the fiery tension of his mother's anxiety, the violence of her hidden terror and rage, lives again in the songs he sings himself to still the unease. Famine child, as his parents were, who brought its shadow here to the high, unblinking walls of London, who taught him with silence that this was so, something that cannot be processed, that is, as sober witnesses at the time attested, beyond anything you can imagine. In my last few years of living at home, before I left for good, I was already doing artwork, and I think there was a lot about me that my parents just couldn't understand what I was up to, and especially artwork. And somehow, I can't remember how, but I got a hold of a paint by numbers set. And paint by numbers was that you would get a landscape or a portrait, and it was all done out in areas with numbers in. And you would get a set of very dilute oil paints, also numbered. And you put so that you do all the number 6 areas with the number 6 colour. So I had one of these, and I changed all the numbers on the colours just at random, and then I painted the picture. And I ended up with a landscape which was kind of a little bit sinister. But my father said, at least you could see what it was supposed to be. And I think this comment sums up my father's irritation and bewilderment that I couldn't just do something normal. My mother stayed out of my room on the whole because it was always such a bloody mess. But occasionally she'd go in there and she'd tidy up. So I'd come home at the end of the day and the still life that I'd been working on was gone. I had a nice clean table, there, table. So, the next poem is about that. I'll wait for a second. Conversation with my mum. What can I do now, Mum, to make this better? Worry a bit more about other people, she says, and a bit less about yourself. Try and be a bit more useful. Don't be so sodden lazy. Tidy up your room, I've never seen such a mess. And throw out all that rubbish on the table, the spikes and the queer shapes. What the hell is it supposed to be, anyway? That's my mother. Throughout the early part of my adult life, the relationship between me and my father was extremely difficult. There were times when we didn't talk at all, didn't see each other, and in a way I think that was really unfair because it was inevitable. He was a man who had a deep commitment to very traditional values, and he had a son who wanted a different life, and we just clashed about it. When I was around 30, we began very tentatively to try and make some moves to repair some of the damage we'd done, but then he died suddenly. So, of course I regret the fact that we couldn't have that time to try and make things a little bit better. And I feel shame about the relationship that we made together. But this next poem is about the aftermath of that. It's called Ceasefire. If you had lived beyond that 80 years and 10, if you had not been who you were, and I not either, if we had not stood in such furious opposition, hating with the strength of fathomless love. I am each brick in this wall, each generation of thought sprayed carelessly on my surface, only to fade and peel as time scrapes past. I cannot hold you by the hand, nor you I, and no words exist that have not already fallen between us. You would have tried to listen above the so-called silence of what could not be said. I know that. We would likely have settled for some truce, some ceasefire. I had an uncle, Jim, who I'm named after, of course. He was my godfather, and when I was a child, he was my favourite uncle. I think about him a lot because I think if Jim had the sort of opportunities that I had, his life might have been very different, and only one generation separates us, but he didn't. He didn't fit in with the restrictions of his life, and I think he took to drink to manage the frustration and anger that he felt about that. He was a pain in the arse when he was drunk, as he was along when I was older. A cousin of mine once told me that he, my cousin, he was asking about me to Jim. He said, why didn't Jimmy come out in the buildings with the rest of us, as if somehow I had been disloyal. And he told me that Jim had said Jimmy had brains and he used them to get out. But there was no out for Jimmy. My Uncle Jim. My uncle had a slipped disc, agony even when it was getting better. He ground his teeth through the night and in the morning tried to get his trousers on without bending his back. An impossible task it was, but I do not remember him asking for help. The men on the job allowed him to break up early to make the tea and to fry eggs for their breakfast on the end of a shovel. But when I went out on the job with him, I was ashamed that my huge, strong uncle was only a tea boy. Loved brother, it says on its grave. It stands as the days and nights pass in the sun and in the rain. The first job I ever had when I left school was a garden labourer, 3rd class. I worked in Hyde Park, actually I worked in Hyde Park Corner, and for anybody who knows that part of the park, they might know that there's a small building on the boundary of that park. It's a Victorian Greek temple, and it has the same kind of quality as Doctor Who's TARDIS, which is much bigger inside than it looks from the outside. And we used to have our tea breaks in there, and I was in there one day and I was talking to the guy at the same table as me, and I said that I was an ex-Catholic, whereupon an older Irishman leaned across from an adjoining table and he said, you're never an ex-Catholic, you're a lapsed Catholic. As I've got older, I've come to realise he was right, you're never an ex-Catholic. But I don't like that I'm a lapsed Catholic. There was no lapse. So I've come with 2 short theological poems in memory of this man who tried to put me straight. The first one's called God. Look, someone has to be in charge of the afterlife. It's a scary thought that you get there and nothing has been organised. No hierarchies, no schedules, just wandering about not knowing what to do for the rest of eternity. Jesus, at least this life ends. The second poem is called Everyone's Welcome. The Catholic Church got rid of our ancestors, sent them off to heaven or the other place. We will meet our loved ones again, they say, when we too cross over. No ancestors hanging around close by and aware, not owed anything by anybody, except perhaps our prayers to help them if they've got stuck somewhere. Because if you're bound for heaven, there are a number of places you might have to spend time in on the way. If you're bound for hell, though, you can go straight there, no problem. They won't even check your passport. Now, in heaven, you might find us less questions if you were a bishop than if you were, say, a prostitute. In hell, there's none of that. Bishops, prostitutes, all the little mean people, and the spectacular criminals. Everyone's welcome. But don't think your achievements will get you any special favours or privilege. It's a very egalitarian place. I'm going to finish with this poem. So I had a teacher in primary school called Miss Healy, and like a few of the other teachers in the school, she was a brute. And one day we were going to do spelling. She said, "Get out your exercise books and write now on the cover." We all said spelling, and she wasn't willing to give us that, so she said vocabulary. Knowing that none of us would know how to spell that. Vocabulary. My great-grandparents were native Irish speakers, remote enough not to have been caught and punished. Their children learned English. This child learned Posh, the language of the conquerors, the administrators of empire. Those who are so happy to know their place that they do not even know that they know. I got so many words. I took them from the dictionary, the Oxford English mostly. Prized them out with a tiny crowbar and keep them in my wallet. Thank you.